I was 23 the summer I took that solo camping trip. I'd never gone alone before, but I was in a weird place in life. Burnt out, drifting. A long relationship had just ended. Work felt like a dead end. Everything back home felt loud and useless. I needed to be somewhere quiet, just for a while. Somewhere far away from cities and phones and all the static of normal life. So I packed up my gear, checked the weather, and drove 6 hours north into a forest preserve I'd read about online. It wasn't an official campsite, just a cluster of old trails and game paths winding through pine woods and thickets of birch, the kind of place you could walk for days and never see another person. Exactly what I wanted. The last 2 miles of the drive were on an unpaved road that looked like it hadn't been graded in years. It rattled my car half to death, but I made it to the trailhead, a dirt lot with one faded sign nailed to a tree. I parked, threw on my pack, and started walking. The forest was perfect. The trail dipped and climbed over roots and rocks, then narrowed into a winding path between tall trees. I didn't see any litter, no signs of recent camps. Birds chirped above, and the deeper I got, the more the modern world felt like it was slipping away behind me. I walked for about 3 hours before I found a spot that felt right. A soft rise above a little stream, open enough for a tent, with some fallen logs I could use to sit on or cook over. The place felt untouched, like no one had been there in years. I set up camp, built a small fire ring, boiled water for dinner, and watched the sun fall behind the tree line. No cell signal, no noises but the forest. That first night, I felt exactly what I was looking for. Peace. But peace in the woods can feel strange, too. Once the fire was out and the stars were up, the darkness got thick. You don't really know how dark the world can get until you've sat in the forest with no flashlight. It's not like in town. It's a black you can feel in your bones. The kind that makes you start noticing every single sound. A rustle, a crack, something moving way off, just out of view. Most of it's animals, raccoons, deer, maybe a porcupine. But when you're alone, your mind doesn't stop at animal, keeps going. I slept in short stretches, not because I was scared, at least not yet, but because the stillness was too complete. My ears kept reaching for sound, any sound, and when they got it, I'd snap awake. It was the second night when everything started to go wrong. The day had passed quietly. I hiked to a small ridge where I could see the valley through breaks in the trees, cooked a little pasta over my burner, jotted some notes in my journal. By the time the sun was down, I was tired in that deep, satisfying way that hiking gives you. I had a small fire going. I watched it burn down, then poured water over the coals, scattered the ashes, and got into the tent. It was maybe an hour after I'd fallen asleep that I woke up to a sound. It was soft at first, a dry rustling like something brushing through the undergrowth. It stopped, then started again. It was close. I stayed still, eyes open, listening hard. There was something off about the sound. It wasn't the usual snap of a twig under hoof or paw. It was longer, dragging, then a pause, then again. Drag, pause, drag, pause. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and sat up. I didn't open the tent. I just listened. The sound had stopped again. I waited. Then it came again. Closer. Drag. Pause. Then another noise. Something that sent a cold, sudden chill through my chest. A voice, barely above a whisper. It wasn't speaking clearly. It sounded broken, like someone trying to talk but forgetting how. Like a child repeating nonsense words, but with this awful sing-song lilt. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but one part came through, soft and shaky, repeated several times. My pretties, my pretties. My mouth went dry. It sounded like a woman's voice, but cracked and hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in years. There was something unwell about it, like her brain and body weren't in sync. I turned off my flashlight. Whatever it was, I didn't want to shine a light on it yet. I lay still inside the tent, barely breathing. The voice kept repeating itself, sometimes mumbling, sometimes pausing long enough for me to think it had stopped, until it didn't. Then came another sound, one that froze me completely. The zipper of the tent, the outer one, the rain fly, it moved. Not fast, not enough to open it. Just a single, deliberate tug downward. A test. I couldn't move. My whole body locked up. Nothing happened after that. Just silence. I don't know how long I waited, maybe an hour, maybe more. Eventually, when I couldn't take it anymore, I turned the flashlight back on and unzipped the tent myself. I leaned out and swept the beam in every direction. Nothing.
No footprints.
No sign of anything moving. Just the black forest, the pale trees, and my fire pit, cold and quiet. But I knew what I'd heard. That sound wasn't an animal. That voice wasn't the wind. I stayed up until sunrise. When the morning finally came, I packed fast. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. I just knew I needed to get out of those woods. I doused the fire ring, packed out my trash, and slung my pack over my shoulders. The walk back should have taken 2 or 3 hours. Took almost 5. I kept stopping, kept hearing things, kept thinking I saw something low to the ground, crawling behind fallen logs or slipping between tree trunks. A shape, a flicker, never long enough to be sure. At one point, I found something strange. A trail of bent grass and crushed ferns cutting sideways across the forest floor, not following any path or trail. It looked like someone had dragged a bag or a body through there. I didn't follow it. I kept walking. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for days. I dropped the pack in the trunk, slammed the hatch shut, and didn't even bother changing out of my boots. I drove straight down the dirt road, scraping rocks, fishtailing around a bend, until I hit pavement and didn't look back. Later that night, back in my apartment, I unpacked in silence. I went through my gear slowly, checking for damage. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The side pocket of my backpack, one I rarely use, was unzipped. Inside was a small, smooth stone, perfectly round, flat, pale gray. Not mine. I didn't pick it up. I would have remembered. Someone had unzipped that pocket. Someone had placed that stone inside. That night in the forest, someone was crawling around my tent in the dark, whispering, dragging themselves through the leaves, calling out in a voice that didn't feel like it belonged in a human throat. They touched my tent. They tried the zipper. They got close enough to put something inside my pack. I don't go camping alone anymore. I don't hike past where I can hear cars or people. I sleep with the zippers tied shut. I use locks even on tents. It might sound paranoid, but I don't care, because I know what I saw or almost saw. There are people in those woods. Not witches, not ghosts, just broken people, sick people, crawling through the trees, whispering into the dark, waiting for someone to be alone. And if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't stayed quiet, if I'd unzipped that tent just a little too soon, I don't think I'd be here telling this story. I think I'd still be out there, somewhere on the forest floor. Just another lost thing in the dark. I've done a lot of solo camping in my life. Most of the time it's peaceful. I've always liked being away from everything. No cars, no phones, no obligations. Just me, my pack, and the woods. But there's one trip I took that changed the way I look at isolation forever. I still camp, but not the same way. Not far off the grid. Not without cell service. Not after what happened that night in late September, deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I remember it vividly because it started out like any other trip. I had 3 days off work, and I wanted to spend them where I wouldn't hear another voice or see another light after sundown. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, 2 years earlier. It wasn't marked on most maps. A small patch of clearing next to a cold, narrow stream, only accessible by a long, steep trailhead that most people avoided. I parked at the end of the dirt road just past noon, threw my pack on, and hiked in under a sky full of pale gray clouds. The weather was dry and cool, and the leaves were already beginning to turn. The trail was rough, lots of rocks and switchbacks, but I didn't mind. It took me a little over 2 hours to get to the clearing. The site looked the same as I remembered. There was a flat patch of mossy ground beneath a thick pine canopy and a fallen log near the edge, perfect for sitting or cooking on. The stream ran quietly about 30 feet away, down a gentle slope. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and set up camp without rushing. Everything was calm, peaceful, quiet. By the time evening rolled in, I had a fire going, a full belly, and nothing on my mind except how good the fresh air felt. The sky darkened slow, like it was giving me time to settle in. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers. I poured water over it, brushed my teeth, and climbed into the tent. I woke up maybe 2 hours later, unsure of what pulled me out of sleep. There was no sound at first, no wind,
No rustling.
just this strange stillness that didn't feel like normal quiet. It felt loaded, like the woods were holding their breath. Then I heard something that sounded like a soft thump. Not loud, just one, like someone stepped on a branch and it snapped underfoot. It wasn't close, maybe 20 yards off. I reached for my flashlight and waited. Then came another sound, a dragging noise, like skin or cloth brushing across the forest floor. It didn't move quickly, but it was steady. It stopped every few seconds, then started again. And then I heard breathing. Not animal breathing, no snorts, no heavy lungs. It was human, ragged, mouth open, sounded wrong. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and peeked out. I didn't expect to see anyone. I really didn't. I thought maybe it was a bear nosing through the woods or even a deer moving oddly. But I saw her, a woman. She was on all fours, crawling through the underbrush, maybe 30 feet away from my tent. At first I thought she might be injured. Her knees dragged like she couldn't support her weight properly, and her hands were curled inward against the dirt. She was moving with these jolting, twitchy movements, like her limbs weren't working the way they should. She was wearing dark clothing, ripped up, dirty, sticking to her like it was soaked in sweat. Her skin was streaked with mud, and her back moved sharply with each breath. She didn't look up, just kept crawling, whispering something under her breath I couldn't make out. I froze. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want her to see me. My eyes adjusted slowly, and the more I stared at her, the more I realized something was very wrong. Her arms were long, too long, or maybe it was the way she held them. Elbows bent out, wrists loose, dragging her fingertips in the dirt. Her spine looked uneven, arched in a sharp way that didn't match a normal crawl. She moved like she was trying to stay low, but she couldn't stop shaking. Then she stopped. She was just sitting there now, not quite kneeling, not quite crouching. Her body sort of folded in on itself. Her head jerked once like a muscle spasm, then again, and then she started scratching at her arms. Fast, raw swipes that looked painful, like she was trying to peel something off her skin. That's when I realized she wasn't mumbling. She was saying words, single ones, out of order. Things like itch, inside, burn, and sharp, just tossed out into the quiet like they meant something only to her. I ducked back into the tent, pulled the zipper half closed, and waited. Then she made this sound, half breath, half whimper, almost like a dog's bark, but softer. Then she went silent again. A few minutes passed. I couldn't tell if she was still there. I leaned forward and looked again. She was gone, but not in the way I expected. She hadn't run. There were no snapping twigs, no sound of movement. She was just not there anymore. I stayed inside the tent for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I kept my knife out and held onto the flashlight, but I didn't use either. I just listened. Nothing else happened until sunrise. When it got light enough to see clearly, I stepped out and checked the area where I'd seen her. There were drag marks on the ground and small patches of torn fabric. Bits of skin, maybe, or some peeled bark. I couldn't tell. The air smelled weird. Not like death, more like iron. Or blood. I packed everything up in a rush. Took down the tent without eating, didn't even make coffee. I shoved gear into my pack and started hiking out. About 20 minutes down the trail, I noticed something ahead of me. A figure. At first I thought maybe I was hallucinating from the lack of sleep, but it was real. It was a woman again. Upright this time, walking slowly along the edge of the trail, her arms hanging straight down. Her clothes were dark and ragged. Her hair stuck to her neck and shoulders, wet with sweat or something else. I stopped. She didn't turn toward me. She just kept walking slowly into the trees. I didn't follow. I didn't call out. I just turned off the trail and bushwhacked around that spot as wide as I could, making noise as I moved so she'd hear me and know I was there. She didn't react. I made it back to the car 2 hours later, legs aching, mouth dry, nerves shot. I threw the pack into the trunk and drove the entire way home in silence. Didn't even turn on the radio. I felt like I just walked away from something I wasn't meant to see. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The crawling, the twitching, the words, that spine, the way her body looked like it didn't know how to be human anymore. Eventually, I talked myself down. Maybe she was high, meth, bath salts, something synthetic that stripped her mind and made her lose control. Maybe she was suffering from exposure or psychosis. It happens, especially that far out when no one's watching. People break, minds go sideways, bodies follow. But even now, years later, I don't fully believe that's all it was. Because when I remember how she moved, how her limbs bent wrong, how her shoulders snapped when she twisted, how she whispered things that didn't make sense like she was narrating some kind of change, I still feel that cold crawl up my neck. It was like I caught her in the middle of turning into something else. Not literally, not a creature, but something worse in a way. Something that used to be human and couldn't hold on to it anymore. And I was never supposed to see it happen. That was the part that stuck with me the most. The way she didn't react, like I was beneath her notice, like the part of her that knew how to be afraid or ashamed had already been burned out. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't prey. I was just a bystander. Since then, I've never camped alone again. And I'll never forget the sound her body made as she dragged it across the dirt in the dark, whispering words no one should say out loud. Not out there, not alone, not becoming something else. When I was younger, probably around 14 or 15, my family used to camp every summer at this one state park. It became a routine thing. We'd go for a week, sometimes longer, and camp in the same general area year after year. It wasn't anything fancy, just a long stretch of forest with a few scattered campgrounds, each with a picnic table, a fire pit, and a flat patch for tents. The bathrooms were pit toilets in small wooden shacks a short walk away.
No showers.
No electricity, just woods and more woods in every direction. Those trips were mostly about slowing down. My parents liked to fish and read. My little sister spent most of her time collecting rocks or trying to spot deer. I liked the quiet, but it was my best friend who made those summers what they were. His name was Saond. His family camped at the same park every year too, and over time we planned it so both our families reserved sites near each other. We had a ritual. Every night after dark, we would walk through the woods. Just the two of us. No real destination. No reason other than it gave us a little thrill, a little freedom. We called it the ritual like it meant something more than it did. But really, it was just two bored kids testing their nerves. We'd leave the glow of the campfire, step into the tree line with our flashlights in hand, and walk the winding deer trails under the trees. The real trick was walking with our flashlights off. We both had small ones, basic plastic tubes powered by AA batteries. But we rarely used them. We liked seeing how far we could get without light. Our eyes would adjust to the moonlight and the soft shapes around us. The woods became a blur of black shapes and silhouettes. Everything looked different at night. Familiar paths took on a new kind of depth. Branches looked like hands, stumps like crouching animals, and every little sound made us stop and strain our ears. That one night stands out more than any other. It was near the end of one of those trips. We'd been doing our ritual every night without any issues, getting a little bolder each time. I think that night we wanted to see just how far we could go. We decided we'd walk deeper into the woods than we ever had before. The sun had set over an hour earlier. The air had that deep, unmoving quiet you only get in the forest at night. You could hear the crack of dry twigs under our shoes, the light hiss of wind up in the branches, but nothing else. We slipped past the tents and the fire pits and the low voices from other camps. Once we were deep enough in, we shut our flashlights off. The path under our feet was faint, barely a trail at all. More of a game trail than something humans made. It weaved around thick brush and old down trees. Everything smelled like moss and pine and damp soil. We were maybe half a mile from the nearest campsite, maybe more. The sounds of people had faded out completely. That's when we first heard it, a soft whisper. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe leaves brushing together. But it wasn't. It had a rhythm to it, a pattern like someone actually speaking, only low and fast and broken up. We both stopped walking. We turned on our flashlights at the same time, sweeping the beams behind us. The trees lit up in pale yellow streaks, but there was nothing there, just more of the same woods, twisted trunks and thin underbrush. We stood there for a bit, listening. Everything felt frozen, the kind of frozen that makes the back of your neck tighten. But eventually we shrugged it off and kept walking. Maybe it was some animal or even a branch snapping in a weird way. We'd heard strange things before. It was part of the fun. Then we heard it again. Same kind of whispering, but this time it was louder, closer. We stopped dead in our tracks. It wasn't coming from behind us now. It was more to the side, off the trail, deeper in the brush. We pointed our lights in that direction and started scanning the woods. Slowly. Then we saw something. At first I couldn't make sense of it. It looked like a bundle of clothes on the ground, dark and lumpy. But then it moved, crawled. Person. A woman. She was crawling across the forest floor like an animal, elbows and knees dragging through the dirt. Her hands curled and stiff like she didn't know how to use them right. Her clothes were dark, caked with dirt, and she was whispering as she moved. Just random sounds, not real words, just pieces of them, over and over. I froze. I've never felt that kind of cold inside my body before. Not from the weather, from something deeper, something primal. She kept crawling toward us slowly, whispering to the ground, not even looking at us at first. Then she stopped. She lifted her head and looked right at us. The light from our flashlights hit her face. Her eyes squinted from the brightness, but she didn't look scared. She just looked lost, completely out of it. Her hair was tangled and full of leaves. Her face had smears of dirt across it like she'd been rubbing it on the ground. She was breathing through her mouth, quick and shallow. She got up slowly, like it took effort to remember how. Then she stood there, swaying slightly, and said she was looking for her campsite. It was only then that I realized how thin she was. Her arms hung loose at her sides. She looked unstable, like her legs weren't sure if they wanted to hold her. We didn't say anything. We didn't know what to say. We just started walking back toward the campground with her behind us. She followed. Every now and then, we'd glance back to make sure she was still there. Her eyes were half closed and her arms hung stiff at her sides. She muttered things as she walked. Nothing made sense. It was like she was thinking out loud, but none of the thoughts were complete. The walk back felt longer than it had on the way out. The forest felt tighter. Every shadow seemed darker than before. I wanted to get back to the light of the campfires, the voices, the safety of tents and picnic tables. Finally, we reached the edge of the campground. We stopped near the dirt road where the campsites began. Some people were still up, talking near their fires. We turned and watched as the woman walked past us and wandered down the path, zigzagging like she didn't remember where she was supposed to go. We followed her until we saw a group of 3 people at a site a few spots down from ours. They were sitting in chairs, talking and drinking. The woman stumbled up to them, and at first none of them reacted. Then one of the men stood up fast and rushed over. He looked her over, helped her sit down. They started talking low, but from where we were, we could tell by their expressions that they hadn't even known she was gone. It turned out she'd gotten drunk, or high, maybe both, and had gone out into the woods to find a bathroom and got turned around.
No flashlight, no shoes.
Just wandered off into the dark. Her group hadn't noticed until she came stumbling back with 2 teenagers behind her. We didn't get thanked. No one even looked at us twice. Sean and I went back to our tent, sat there for a long time without saying a word. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her crawling through the dirt, whispering. Looking back, I don't think she meant to scare us. I don't think she was even aware of what she was doing. But that's what made it worse. She was real, not a ghost. Not some story, just a person who'd wandered too far into the dark and forgot how to be a person. That night stuck with me for a long time, not because anything bad actually happened, but because something almost did. If we hadn't gone that deep into the woods that night, if we hadn't heard her whispering, she might have spent the whole night out there, cold, confused, maybe not even made it back at all. It made me realize how easy it is to disappear, even surrounded by people. Even in a campground full of families and lanterns and laughter, you can take a few wrong steps and vanish into the trees. We never did the ritual after that. Something about it stopped being fun. It became too real, too close, too easy to imagine the worst, and too hard to forget the feeling of flashlights cutting through the dark, only to land on someone who should never have been there in the first place. I never liked camping with my family. I went along because I had to. That's how it was when I was younger. My dad would decide we were going, and my mom would pack everything whether she wanted to or not. My older brother enjoyed it, or at least he pretended to. I never did. Not really. The last time we all went together was the summer before I started college. I was 18, old enough to say no, but not in a house where saying no ever got you anywhere. My dad said we were going to take one last trip together, something special, before everything changed. So we packed up the car and drove out to the forest like we always had. This time, he picked a more remote spot. He found some place in a national forest about 4 hours from home. No marked campground, just a clearing at the end of a rough forest road that dead-ended at a trailhead. There was no one else around when we got there. It was the middle of the week, and this wasn't a place people stumbled into. You had to know it was there. The road had chewed up the bottom of our car by the time we arrived. We unloaded the gear in silence. The air was dry and full of pine, and everything felt far away. No cell signal, no buildings, no other cars, just trees, the occasional bird call, and the crunch of our boots on dry needles. My dad set up the tent while my mom laid out food on the fold-up table. My brother started a fire in the ring that had been built by some camper long ago. Big stones in a rough circle, blackened in the middle. I walked out behind the tent, past the trees, to where the hill dropped steeply. From there, I could see the forest stretching on and on. Nothing man-made in sight. Felt like the edge of the world. That first night passed quietly. We sat around the fire and ate, and when it got dark, we turned in early. The tent was one of those big canvas ones, old but tough, the kind where all 4 of us had room to sleep in a row. I was at one end, near the entrance, and I remember lying there, listening to the silence outside.
No frogs, no crickets.
Just still air. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was more of a feeling, like something had shifted. I stayed still, listening. Everyone else was asleep, or at least breathing steadily. I sat up slowly and unzipped the front flap of the tent, just enough to peek outside. The moon was bright, lighting up the clearing in pale blue. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but something didn't feel right. The fire had gone out. The coals weren't even glowing anymore. That wasn't normal. My brother usually built fires that stayed warm for hours, sometimes until morning. I stepped out barefoot and walked over to the ring. I leaned down and touched one of the stones. Cold. I stood up and looked around again. Still nothing. I told myself it was nothing and went back to the tent. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, we went on a hike. My dad wanted us to follow a trail he'd found on some old topographic map, one that cut through a valley about 2 miles from where we'd camped. There wasn't much of a path, just a faint game trail winding through underbrush and between fallen trees. We hiked single file, my dad leading, my brother behind him, then me with my mom in the back. She was moving slower than usual and stopped a lot to take water breaks. After a while, my dad stopped walking and pointed out something in the dirt. I stepped forward to look. There were boot prints, spaced far apart, leading off the trail and deeper into the woods. They weren't ours. We'd been following this trail since camp and hadn't passed anyone. The prints weren't old either. The edges were sharp. No pine needles had blown into them yet. My dad shrugged and kept walking, but I kept looking at them until they disappeared into the undergrowth. They looked like work boots, wide, heavy, the kind of thing you'd wear on a job site, not a trail. We made it to the valley, had a snack, and turned around. The way back took longer because my mom had twisted her ankle on a loose rock. She didn't fall, but she limped most of the way. When we got back to camp, something felt different. Nothing was missing, but things were off. One of the camp chairs had been knocked over. A fork was lying in the dirt near the table, even though we hadn't eaten since morning. The cooler was closed, but not the way we'd left it. One of the latches was undone. I asked if anyone had come back ahead of us. They all said no. That night, we skipped the fire. My mom stayed in the tent with her leg up. My dad sat outside for a while, staring into the dark, but came in early. My brother and I lay side by side, staring at the ceiling of the tent. I didn't sleep for hours. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, and moving just beyond the tent. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding, listening. The steps circled the tent once. Then again. They stopped near the back. I waited. There was a sound like metal tapping on canvas. A light brush, then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun came up, I went out and looked around. There were boot prints again, like the ones we saw on the trail. They circled the tent. One of the prints near the back was deeper, like whoever it was had stood there for a while. I didn't say anything to the others. My mom looked pale and tired. My dad was already packing things up. He said we'd head out early because of her ankle, but I think he felt it too, that something wasn't right. We loaded the car and started driving back. The dirt road was rougher than before, like it had rained somewhere up the ridge. The car jolted and scraped the whole way. When we finally hit pavement, we all exhaled at once. No one said much on the ride home. 2 weeks later, my brother called me. He'd been going through his backpack and found something he didn't recognize. An old, rusted knife wedged into one of the side pockets. It wasn't ours. Not any of ours. It was dull and dirty. The blade chipped, the handle wrapped in cracked tape. None of us had brought it. We never figured out how it got there. After that trip, my family never went camping together again. My parents said it was because we were getting older that we were too busy. But I knew the real reason. That trip had felt wrong in a way none of us could explain. Someone had been out there with us, watching, moving around our camp, getting close enough to touch our things, maybe even planning something worse. We were lucky to leave when we did. I still think about it sometimes, what might have happened if we'd stayed just one more night, what they were waiting for, and why they chose us. I didn't have a reason to go camping that weekend, other than I wanted to get away from everything for a while. I'd been feeling boxed in lately. Too much time staring at screens, dealing with noise, cars, crowds. I needed the quiet. So I threw my gear into the back of my car, picked a spot on the map a few hours away, and started driving before I could change my mind. The area I picked wasn't particularly famous or popular. It was national forest land, not a formal campsite, more of a dispersed camping kind of place. You could pull off on some forest roads, find a clearing, and set up on your own. That's what I wanted. Isolation. No loud groups, no RV generators humming through the night, no families arguing over hot dogs. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive up was easy. The last hour was on dirt roads, some of them narrow and twisty with steep drops to one side, but nothing I hadn't handled before. It was late afternoon when I found a decent spot. There was a bit of a turnout off a lesser-used road, and about 100 feet in, a flat clearing surrounded by pines. Someone had camped there before. I could tell by the old fire ring and a few crushed beer cans someone had left behind, but it wasn't recent. I unpacked, set up my tent, gathered some fallen branches for a fire later, and then just sat for a while, breathing in the pine and the silence. The stillness out there felt like something physical. There wasn't a single engine, not even a plane overhead. Just the faint rustling of branches high up in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was the kind of silence you don't realize you miss until you have it again. I ate a simple dinner, trail mix, jerky, and some boiled water over instant rice, and watched the sky turn gold, then purple, then that deep, quiet blue of night. I built a small fire with the wood I'd gathered, kept it low, just enough for some warmth and light. I stayed up for a while, staring into it, half dozing in my camp chair, feeling the tension slowly leak out of me. When the fire burned down to coals, I doused it with water, kicked some dirt over it just to be safe, and climbed into my tent. I fell asleep fast, and for a while, everything was good. Then I woke up. I didn't open my eyes right away, but I was fully awake. I had that sense of being yanked out of sleep too fast. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I didn't know why yet. I stayed still, listened. It wasn't completely quiet anymore. There was a faint crunching sound outside. Not constant, just a few steps, then nothing. A pause. Then another couple of steps. I waited, listening harder. It didn't sound like a big animal. Not heavy enough for a bear or elk. Not enough snapping branches. But it didn't sound small either. I've been around raccoons and squirrels in the woods. They move fast and erratic. This sounded slower, more careful. It was close too, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I reached slowly for my flashlight and sat up. I didn't unzip the tent. I wasn't stupid. I just listened, holding my breath. The steps circled a bit, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing or checking something. Then silence again. I stayed there, rigid, for what felt like 20 minutes. Eventually I lay back down, not because I was relaxed, but because I couldn't sit like that anymore. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. By the time the sun lit up the sides of the tent, I was already up. I stepped out, blinking in the light, and checked around the clearing. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks I could identify, just the forest the way it had been the day before. Maybe it was a deer, I told myself, curious one or a lost one, or something harmless that just wandered too close. Still, I packed up my gear before breakfast and hiked a little further down the road, just enough to feel like I wasn't in the exact same spot. I found a place where the trees opened up onto a kind of natural bowl, and there was a little ridge on one side with a view over the valley. I set up there instead. It wasn't as flat, but I liked the view, and the openness made me feel like I'd see something coming before it got too close. The second day passed quietly. I explored a little, found some deer tracks, a dry creek bed, and signs of old logging, big stumps with rusted wedges still stuck in them. I cooked again over my little stove and sat watching the sky darken. No fire this time. I didn't feel like drawing attention. Just ate, cleaned up, and got into the tent. Took me longer to fall asleep, but eventually I did. And I woke up again. I've been a safari guide for over a decade, suddenly mostly in the Lowveld of South Africa. Only this time, it's one of the most beautiful and raw places you can be. Just that wide open bushveld, overwhelming thorny acacia trees, that was almost dry riverbeds. I held still for long stretches of land that seem untouched. Finally, but as much as it's I turned on my flashlight, it's also wild. Unzipped the door, really wild, and peeked out. That's something I always kept in mind. Just trees, the low even ridge, after years of leading tourists against the log where I'd left it. Still, nothing ever fully prepares you for certain moments out here. Still nothing, especially when the line between man and nature gets thinner than you thought possible. I wasn't going to stay another night. That time of year when the mornings are so cold it feels like your bones are wrapped in ice. But the feeling I had, the temperature drops close to freezing at night, wrong feeling in my chest, especially out in the bush where there's no concrete or city warmth to hold the heat. Ate a few protein bars while walking, crisp, and started making my way back to the car and golden. It was maybe 4 or 5 miles back up the road, animals, people, even the wind. Took me a couple hours. My buddy Greg and I had finished setting up our temporary camp near a dried-up riverbed. No hikers. We weren't guiding any guests at the time. When I got to my car, this trip was just for I noticed something strange. We liked to get away for a few days now and then. Not track wildlife without the pressure of tourists. Walked away from the vehicle reconnect on with the first day in a quiet, personal way. These were fresh. We picked a clearing that had decent visibility and set up 2 dome tents. They weren't treaded like hiking boots either. The saws were flat, no protection, more like just work boots, sleeping bags, and instinct. And they didn't go anywhere. We liked it. They just circled a small dinner on the camp stove. It was like someone had walked up to a bit of bread, studied it, nothing fancy, and then walked backwards in their own steps to hide where they went. We didn't talk much that night, locked the doors, and restarted the silence out there. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. When I got home, the distant whoop of hyenas, I told myself I was overreacting. Branches as maybe it was another camper who saw a car and checked to see if anyone was around. If you're lucky or unlucky, maybe someone got depending on how you see it back. The low rumble I tried to forget about far off in the distance. I didn't talk to anyone about it. The stars were bright. I just moved on. No clouds, but a week later, wide open sky. I noticed something. I crawled into my tent. One of the side pockets on my pack was I didn't bring a cot or even a mat. I know I had closed it. I had a thick sleeping bag rated secure because I don't like losing things. And I always preferred to stay as close to the ground as possible. Gives you better insulation. And your knife was out of its sheath and just lying there. I fell asleep pretty fast, like someone had taken it out. You get after a full day out in the sun and decided to leave it, where your body just gives in and everything goes quiet. The trip. At some point, still don't know what happened out there. I woke up. I still go camping sometimes. I didn't know why at first, but never alone. No sound, no light, never without cell signal. Just never too far off the road that something had changed. I never reported anything. The first thing I noticed was how warm I was. Not just inside my sleeping bag. No injuries. My back felt especially just a long weekend in the woods, and not something or someone. There was watched me, walked around my tent, soft, almost spongy but heavy, and didn't want to be leaning against a big pillow or someone had rolled over and pressed up against my back. Except it's strange how some moments in life stick with you. My back, even when they don't last the canvas wall of the tent. You go years without thinking about them. I just lay there, small brings it back, eyes open in the darkness, a sound, every sense on high alert, a change in the wind. I slowly shifted my breathing how it is to become shallow and quiet at Ginny Springs, trying not to let my chest rise too much. But I still remember pounding so hard the air felt like it might give me away. Heavy and I started piecing it something was waiting to happen. My back was against the side of the tent then. Which meant a few friends and I had planned a camping trip for the weekend. Something just to get out of the city and spend some time in nature. Something warm. Ginny Springs was always a favorite spot and big. The water was bigger than any of the usual suspects. Perfect for floating or not diving. A hyena. And the whole place had that mix of wild and relaxed that only Florida Springs could offer. And it wasn't just brushing against the tent. We'd been there a few times before. It was using it. Set up sleeping against trees, using the tent, swam until our skin turned raw from the sun. That like a wave of cold that replaced all the warmth. We got there in the early afternoon and found a decent spot just off the main campground area. Use shade during the day, close to the river, shelter from the wind behind vehicles, trees, or rocks. We set up our tents, to find one lying against a tent, and using my body floating through the fabric and drinking cheap beer under the sun. That was new. It was hot and terrifying. Mid-90s, even I didn't move a muscle, but the water was cold enough to trying to figure out the next move. By nightfall, but there was no move had settled in. No plan. We ate, no backup, drank some more, no weapon within reach, and sat around even the fire if there was talking about nothing. It would have made no difference. I remember laughing more that night than I had in weeks. If I startled it, no one was could have come through that canvas. We had no signal, no clocks to watch. Time stretched, just the pop of the fire. I have no idea how long I lay there. Insects could have been 5 minutes or an hour. I headed into my tent. The only thing that changed was the sound. A couple of the others stayed up a little longer. Came from the other tent. I was wiped out, hushed and between the sun, the Africa drugs, and the heat. Are you awake? I was ready to crash. Didn't think. I lay in my sleeping bag with the rainfly rolled back so I could feel the breeze. Yes, it was warm. As soon as I said it helped to have the air. I felt the warmth. My eyes were heavy, fast, and I drifted lifted off the side of the tent. Then something woke me, and I heard something was a sound loud and sharp, the dry grass outside, but far enough away that it didn't hit me all the ground. Then more silence. Like a low boom followed by the crack it didn't snap of something heavy just tearing through the air. I didn't move, shook the ground, couldn't just slightly. My whole body felt not enough paralyzed. To sit me up. I was still frozen in place that I noticed when Greg called out like again, a tremor through the louder earth. This time. At first, but still not getting out of his tent. I figured it was someone breaking up logs, still no maybe a car door slamming hard. I think he knew. Sometimes eventually I must have fallen back asleep. The sounds get warped. Adrenaline you hear something 100 yards away and once it drops, next the crash hits hard. So I let it go when I woke up, to drift back it was just before sunrise. 10 minutes later, that pale blue light was spilling not through just the bush, 1 or 2 dozens, and everything was quiet again. First, calm. I thought it was a dream. Like the night had then happened. The volume rose. I unzipped my tent were slowly outside, cautiously, and stepped out. I could hear the grass outside was flat. The rustle of fabric. A huge body had and the unmistakable panic in people's voices. You could see the imprint, even if I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. I followed the trail like the energy around the campground, and not far from the tent, I found the tracks. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside barefoot. The size you don't mistake for anything else. My eyes adjusted fast Greg enough. Stepped out of his tent. The fire had died down to glowing coals, eyes wide, pale, but the rest of the campsite like he had lit with headlamps and flashlights. I just nodded at the tracks. Saw people standing in groups. He didn't say anything. Some holding phones, did I. Even though there was barely any signal out there. We didn't talk about it much during the drive back. I walked and we never told anyone else in detail. It was about 50 feet from where we'd set up. I was used far as a living hot water bottle by a full-grown lion, close enough that I should have paid more attention to the sound I heard earlier. Something I thought I already knew. Not just in the way I needed to. The whole thing. Out here, you're a big guest. Old pine. You're not in charge. Probably 60 feet tall. You're not dominant. Split across the ground. You don't set the rules. One end was buried in the dirt. The animals roots twisted up. You might think you're prepared. The other end had crushed a tent. But the bush always has a way of reminding you that it doesn't care who you are, like aluminum foil. How many years you've done this. You could barely tell how close you think you are to understanding it. There were people around. It was a small miracle that the lion just wanted warmth, some closer, not a meal. Could have gone another way so easily. I don't even know what. If I twitched, the weight of a tree that size doesn't just come off because you want it to. Maybe I wouldn't be here telling people's faces before I knew exactly what had happened. I've seen lions from a distance, from vehicles, even on foot with some of them were trying to help. Never like that. Others just stood there, with only a thin sheet of someone eventually ran to the check-in building. Never where it wasn't just me watching them, but they'd have to call an emergency crew from outside, resting on me. We were far enough close enough to hear my heart beating. Nothing after that. I changed places like that. I don't camp without a vehicle nearby. Someone brought out a camp axe. I set up my tent with more open branches around it, but it was useless. The trunk sleep with my back against the weight too much. That cold might whispering now, but the warmth of something wild is a price someone I never want to pay again. Two maybe, and you better believe no one was sure when someone asked if I'm awake in the middle of the night, and they weren't responding anymore. Not unless I'm damn sure what's listening. The sound I'd heard just a few minutes before it all started. That was the moment it happened. When that tree gave way, maybe from rot or loosened roots or the weight of humidity, it crashed down onto that tent without warning. No time to move, no time to crawl out. Just night sky one moment, crushing weight the next. I walked back to my tent and sat on the edge of my sleeping bag. My heart was racing, but my hands felt cold. The silence of the woods had returned, but it was different now, heavy. Around an hour later, I heard the low rumble of a helicopter. It hovered in slowly, then dropped just above the clearing where a few park vehicles had gathered. The noise was deafening up close, blades chopping the air into vibrations you could feel in your chest. They'd brought a stretcher, a body bag. They lifted someone out, covered in a thick black tarp, and loaded them into the chopper. The rest of the night, no one slept. We didn't pack up, but none of us went back to our tents. We just sat around the cold fire, staring at the embers. Some talked, some didn't. I just kept playing the sound of that fall over and over in my head. That deep, slow snap followed by the crash, the thud, the silence. By morning, park rangers were walking the area, warning people to avoid certain parts of the grounds. They talked to the group where the accident happened. Most of them had already started breaking down their gear. I think everyone wanted to leave. We did too. We packed up in silence.
No jokes.
No rush, just steady hands and eyes on the ground. On the way out, I passed the spot again. They'd roped it off, but the tree still lay there, this huge, motionless thing. It didn't even look like a threat anymore, just another dead tree in the forest. But I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly it happened, how fast the whole world changes. One moment you're asleep in your tent, tired from the day, full from dinner. The next, 1,000 pounds of pine crashes out of the sky and turns everything to silence. The thing that stuck with me the most was how normal the tree looked. No big rot holes, no signs it was about to fall. It looked like every other one around us. You could have picked any tent in that clearing, and that tree still would have landed the same way. It didn't feel like a freak accident. It felt random, and randomness is worse in a way. You can't plan for it. You can't prepare. It just happens. Since then, I've camped plenty more times. But now I pay attention to where I set up. I don't just pick a flat spot and call it good. I look up. I check the branches, the lean of the trunks. I walk a wide circle. If anything looks questionable, I move, even if it takes another hour to find a spot. Because I don't care how rare it is. I've seen what it looks like when it happens. I've seen the aftermath. I've heard the silence that follows, and I don't ever want to hear that sound again. That deep, slow groan of a tree letting go. That final, unannounced fall into the dark. And knowing someone never got back up. I've been a safari guide for over a decade, mostly in the Lowveld of South Africa. It's one of the most beautiful and raw places you can be. Wide open bushveld, thorny acacia trees, dry riverbeds, and vast stretches of land that seem untouched. But as much as it's beautiful, it's also wild. Really wild. That's something I always kept in mind, even after years of leading tourists through the bush. Still, nothing ever fully prepares you for certain moments out here, especially when the line between man and nature gets thinner than you thought possible. It was midwinter, that time of year when the mornings are so cold it feels like your bones are wrapped in ice. The temperature drops close to freezing at night, especially out in the bush where there's no concrete or city warmth to hold the heat. The air gets thin and crisp, and the grasses turn brittle and golden. Everything slows down, animals, people, even the wind. That evening, my buddy Greg and I had finished setting up our temporary camp near a dried-up riverbed. We weren't guiding any guests at the time. This trip was just for us. We like to get away for a few days now and then, track wildlife without the pressure of tourists, and reconnect with the bush in a quiet, personal way. We picked a clearing that had decent visibility and set up 2 dome tents with our backs to a thicket of knobthorn trees. No fences, no protection, just tents, sleeping bags, and instinct. The way we liked it. We cooked a small dinner on the camp stove, some boerewors, beans, and a bit of bread. Nothing fancy, but warm food helps cut the cold. We didn't talk much that night. We both respected the silence out there. You can learn a lot from it. You hear the distant whoop of hyenas, the soft snap of branches as impala or kudu move through the undergrowth, and sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on how you see it, the low rumble of lions far off in the distance. That night, the stars were bright. No clouds, just the wide open sky. I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed tightly. I didn't bring a cot or even a mat. I had a thick sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temps, and I always preferred to stay as close to the ground as possible. Gives you better insulation, and you're less visible to animals. I fell asleep pretty fast. The kind of sleep you get after a full day out in the sun and wind, where your body just gives in and everything goes quiet. At some point deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no light, nothing out of place. Just a sudden awareness that something had changed. The first thing I noticed was how warm I was. Not just inside my sleeping bag. My back felt especially warm. Too warm. And not just warm. There was weight, pressure. Soft, almost spongy, but heavy. Like I was leaning against a big pillow or someone had rolled over and pressed up against my back. Except I was in my tent. Alone. My back was against the canvas wall of the tent. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, eyes open in the darkness, every sense on high alert. I slowly shifted my breathing to become shallow and quiet, trying not to let my chest rise too much. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. I started piecing it together. My back was against the side of the tent, which meant whatever I was feeling was on the outside. Something was lying up against my tent. Something warm, soft, heavy, and big. Bigger than any of the usual suspects. Not a hyena, not a warthog, too still to be a buffalo. And it wasn't just brushing against the tent. It was using it. It was sleeping against me, using the tent for warmth. It hit me slowly, like a wave of cold that replaced all the warmth I'd felt. Lion. I've seen lions do this before. Use shade during the day, or shelter from the wind behind vehicles, trees, or rocks. But to find one lying against a tent, using my body heat through the fabric on a freezing night, that was new and terrifying. I didn't move a muscle. My mind raced, trying to figure out the next move. But there was no move, no plan,
No backup.
no weapon within reach, and even if there was, it would have made no difference. A lion is too fast. If I startled it, it could have come through that canvas like it wasn't even there. Time stretched. I have no idea how long I lay there. Could have been 5 minutes or an hour. The only thing that changed was the sound. Greg's voice came from the other tent, hushed and trembling. "The Africa bug? Are you awake?" My stupid brain didn't think. I didn't whisper. I didn't pause. I answered, "Yes." As soon as I said it, I felt the warmth move. Fast. The weight lifted off the side of the tent, and I heard something massive rustling through the dry grass outside. Heavy paws hitting the ground. Then silence. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. It just left. I didn't move. Couldn't. My whole body felt paralyzed. I was still frozen in place when Greg called out again, louder this time, but still not getting out of his tent. What the hell was that? Still no answer from me. I think he knew. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. Adrenaline only lasts so long, and once it drops, the crash hits hard. When I woke up, it was just before sunrise. That pale blue light was spilling through the bush, and everything was quiet again. Calm, like the night hadn't happened. I unzipped my tent slowly, cautiously, and stepped out. The grass outside was flattened. A huge body had been lying right there. You could see the imprint, big enough that there was no mistaking it. I followed the trail it left as it walked off, and not far from the tents I found the tracks. Huge paw prints, the size you don't mistake for anything else. A male lion. Greg stepped out of his tent around then, eyes wide, pale, looking like he hadn't slept a second. I just nodded at the tracks. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We packed up quietly. We didn't talk about it much during the drive back, and we never told anyone else in detail. What would we even say? That I was used as a living hot water bottle by a full-grown lion? But I learned something important that night. Something I thought I already knew, but not in the way I needed to. Out here, you're a guest. You're not in charge. You're not dominant. You don't set the rules. Nature does. The animals do. You might think you're prepared, think you're experienced. But the bush always has a way of reminding you that it doesn't care who you are, how many years you've done this, or how close you think you are to understanding it. It was a small miracle that the lion just wanted warmth and not a meal. Could have gone another way so easily. If I twitched, panicked, sneezed, who knows? Maybe I wouldn't be here telling this story. The thing is, I've seen lions from a distance, from vehicles, even on foot with armed backup. But never like that. Never with only a thin sheet of tent fabric between us. Never where it wasn't just me watching them, but one watching me, resting on me, close enough to hear my heart beating. After that, I changed some things. I don't camp without a vehicle nearby anymore. I set up my tent with more open space around it. And I never, ever sleep with my back against the tent wall. That cold might bite, but the warmth of something wild is a price I never want to pay again. And you better believe now, when someone asks if I'm awake in the middle of the night, I don't answer right away. Not unless I'm damn sure what's listening. I've been a safari guide for over a decade, mostly in the Lowveld of South Africa. It's one of the most beautiful and raw places you can be. Wide open bushveld, thorny acacia trees, dry riverbeds, and vast stretches of land that seem untouched. But as much as it's beautiful, it's also wild. Really wild. That's something I always kept in mind, even after years of leading tourists through the bush. Still, nothing ever fully prepares you for certain moments out here, especially when the line between man and nature gets thinner than you thought possible. It was midwinter, that time of year when the mornings are so cold it feels like your bones are wrapped in ice. The temperature drops close to freezing at night, especially out in the bush where there's no concrete or city warmth to hold the heat. The air gets thin and crisp, and the grasses turn brittle and golden. Everything slows down, animals, people, even the wind. That evening, my buddy Greg and I had finished setting up our temporary camp near a dried-up riverbed. We weren't guiding any guests at the time. This trip was just for us. We like to get away for a few days now and then, track wildlife without the pressure of tourists, and reconnect with the bush in a quiet, personal way. We picked a clearing that had decent visibility and set up 2 dome tents with our backs to a thicket of knobthorn trees. No fences, no protection, just tents, sleeping bags, and instinct. The way we liked it. We cooked a small dinner on the camp stove, some boerewors, beans, and a bit of bread. Nothing fancy, but warm food helps cut the cold. We didn't talk much that night. We both respected the silence out there. You can learn a lot from it. You hear the distant whoop of hyenas, the soft snap of branches as impala or kudu move through the undergrowth, and sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on how you see it, the low rumble of lions far off in the distance. That night, the stars were bright. No clouds, just the wide open sky. I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed tightly. I didn't bring a cot or even a mat. I had a thick sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temps, and I always preferred to stay as close to the ground as possible. Gives you better insulation, and you're less visible to animals. I fell asleep pretty fast. The kind of sleep you get after a full day out in the sun and wind, where your body just gives in and everything goes quiet. At some point deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no light, nothing out of place. Just a sudden awareness that something had changed. The first thing I noticed was how warm I was. Not just inside my sleeping bag. My back felt especially warm. Too warm. And not just warm. There was weight, pressure. Soft, almost spongy, but heavy. Like I was leaning against a big pillow or someone had rolled over and pressed up against my back. Except I was in my tent. Alone. My back was against the canvas wall of the tent. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, eyes open in the darkness, every sense on high alert. I slowly shifted my breathing to become shallow and quiet, trying not to let my chest rise too much. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. I started piecing it together. My back was against the side of the tent, which meant whatever I was feeling was on the outside. Something was lying up against my tent. Something warm, soft, heavy, and big. Bigger than any of the usual suspects. Not a hyena, not a warthog, too still to be a buffalo. And it wasn't just brushing against the tent, it was using it. It was sleeping against me, using the tent for warmth. It hit me slowly, like a wave of cold that replaced all the warmth I'd felt. Lion. I've seen lions do this before. Use shade during the day, or shelter from the wind behind vehicles, trees, or rocks. But to find one lying against a tent, using my body heat through the fabric on a freezing night, that was new and terrifying. I didn't move a muscle. My mind raced, trying to figure out the next move. But there was no move, no plan,
No backup.
no weapon within reach, and even if there was, it would have made no difference. A lion is too fast. If I startled it, it could have come through that canvas like it wasn't even there. Time stretched. I have no idea how long I lay there. Could have been 5 minutes or an hour. The only thing that changed was the sound. Greg's voice came from the other tent, hushed and trembling. The Africa bug? Are you awake? My stupid brain didn't think. I didn't whisper. I didn't pause. I answered, yes. As soon as I said it, I felt the warmth move. Fast. The weight lifted off the side of the tent, and I heard something massive rustling through the dry grass outside. Heavy paws hitting the ground. Then silence. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. It just left. I didn't move. Couldn't. My whole body felt paralyzed. I was still frozen in place when Greg called out again. Louder this time, but still not getting out of his tent. What the hell was that? Still no answer from me. I think he knew. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. Adrenaline only lasts so long, and once it drops, the crash hits hard. When I woke up, it was just before sunrise. That pale blue light was spilling through the bush, and everything was quiet again. Calm, like the night hadn't happened. I unzipped my tent slowly, cautiously, and stepped out. The grass outside was flattened. A huge body had been lying right there. You could see the imprint, big enough that there was no mistaking it. I followed the trail it left as it walked off, and not far from the tents I found the tracks. Huge paw prints, the size you don't mistake for anything else. A male lion. Greg stepped out of his tent around then, eyes wide, pale, looking like he hadn't slept a second. I just nodded at the tracks. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We packed up quietly. We didn't talk about it much during the drive back, and we never told anyone else in detail. What would we even say? That I was used as a living hot water bottle by a full-grown lion? But I learned something important that night. Something I thought I already knew, but not in the way I needed to. Out here, you're a guest. You're not in charge. You're not dominant. You don't set the rules. Nature does. The animals do. You might think you're prepared, think you're experienced. But the bush always has a way of reminding you that it doesn't care who you are, how many years you've done this, or how close you think you are to understanding it. It was a small miracle that the lion just wanted warmth and not a meal. Could have gone another way so easily. If I twitched, panicked, sneezed, who knows? Maybe I wouldn't be here telling this story. The thing is, I've seen lions from a distance, from vehicles, even on foot with armed backup. But never like that. Never with only a thin sheet of tent fabric between us. Never where it wasn't just me watching them, but one watching me, resting on me, close enough to hear my heart beating. After that, I changed some things. I don't camp without a vehicle nearby anymore. I set up my tent with more open space around it. And I never, ever sleep with my back against the tent wall. That cold might bite, but the warmth of something wild is a price I never want to pay again. And you better believe now, when someone asks if I'm awake in the middle of the night, I don't answer right away. Not unless I'm damn sure what's listening. It was a freezing July night in the Lowveld. The kind of cold that gets into your hands even when you're wearing gloves, and the wind just keeps moving through every layer like you're wearing nothing. I'd been out there a few nights already, camping solo while mapping a few lesser-used animal paths I'd noticed over the past season. No guests, no one to talk to, just me, a notebook, a fire, and the sounds of the bush. I like nights like those. I find some peace in being alone out there. I get to hear the land in its purest form. No cars, no human voices. Just the calls of jackals in the distance. The low groan of an old bull elephant moving through the mopane. And sometimes, when the wind carries just right, the sound of lions. Low and distant, but deep enough to feel it in your chest. That day had been dry, dusty, and long. I'd walked more than 20 kilometers in total, pacing a trail I thought might be a newly forming predator corridor. I saw scat, some half-eaten impala remains, and a few tracks, big ones, fresh enough to still hold shape in the soft dirt. Male lion, maybe two. I made a note of it, but I didn't feel too worried. They move through areas like this all the time. It didn't mean they were staying. I was more focused on finding a decent clearing before night fell. By sunset, I found a suitable spot to pitch the tent. It was just off a dry wash, with a good view in every direction and enough tree cover to block the worst of the wind. I set up my small one-man dome tent, built a modest fire, and boiled some water for tea. I ate a tin of beans and some dried sausage while I watched the sky change colors. From golden to pink to deep blue, the stars started coming out one by one. Even in the cold, the air felt good, clean. I sat by the fire until my eyes started to blur from exhaustion, then climbed into the tent and zipped myself inside. I had my thick sleeping bag unrolled and tucked around me tight, and I was layered up underneath, long underwear, fleece, socks, everything I had. The cold was still finding ways to creep in. The Lowveld doesn't play games in the winter. Even though the daytime could climb into the 20s, the nights often dropped close to zero. I lay on my side, curled up, facing the center of the tent, with my back pressed to the nylon wall. It was thin, but there was no wind that night, so it wasn't flapping. Everything was still. I remember thinking about my cat back home before I fell asleep. Her name's Nala. She's a black and white short-hair, feisty little thing but loyal. Every winter she finds her way behind my back in bed, between me and the wall, tucks herself in and stays there all night. Sometimes I wake up stiff from not moving, just so I don't disturb her. It's a comforting kind of pressure, having something warm pressed behind you while you sleep. That's what I felt sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning. I didn't wake from a sound or a smell. I just stirred slightly in my sleep and realized that the tent wall behind me had changed. It wasn't just cold and slack anymore. It was warm, firm, but soft, and it had weight, like something had settled down behind me, just like Nala used to do. Half asleep, I didn't think much of it at first. I remember thinking, damn, this bag is warmer than I thought, and drifted for a few more seconds before some part of my brain fully woke up and said, that's not your sleeping bag, that's something else. I stayed completely still. That's the first instinct you develop out here. When something doesn't feel right, don't move. Don't breathe too deeply. Just listen. There was no sound. Nothing from outside.
No shifting, no sniffing.
Just that warmth, solid and heavy. Right behind me, pressing into the curve of my back, separated only by that thin layer of tent fabric. It wasn't sharp or bony. It wasn't poking or testing. It was just resting there, settled. I wasn't fully sure what it was, but I had a very good idea. It wasn't a hyena. Hyenas don't rest like that. They pace, nose around, poke things. They don't settle quietly. It wasn't a baboon. Wrong shape, wrong weight, and it sure as hell wasn't a small animal. It was too broad, too dense. It felt like the side of a sofa, warm and plush but undeniably strong. It was a big animal, a really big one. I lay there, feeling every second pass like it was stretching into minutes. My eyes were wide open in the dark. The inside of the tent was pitch black, but I wasn't going to move to grab my torch. Even the rustle of my sleeping bag might alert it. I thought of Nala again, that way she tucks into me at night, that soft purring heat. The thought should have been comforting, but it wasn't anymore. This wasn't my house. This wasn't my cat. This was something else, something wild. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. My muscles started to ache from the stillness. My shoulder was going numb from being locked in one position. But I didn't dare move. My breathing was slow and shallow, trying not to shift the bag or the air around me. Then, very softly, the warmth shifted. It wasn't fast. It wasn't startled. It just got up. The weight lifted. The pressure pulled back. I heard the sound of something brushing against the canvas, and then I heard it step away. Each footfall was heavy, deep, like someone walking in boots through the grass. I could picture it in my mind. That broad back, that thick mane, the deep paws pressing into the earth. It was a lion, a big male, no doubt in my mind, and he'd curled up against my tent like it was a rock, or a termite mound, or just a warm shape to share body heat with. That night was cold enough to bring frost. I know because when I finally got up just after sunrise, the grass was white at the tips. The tent had moisture clinging to it like sweat. I stepped out into the morning light and walked slowly around to the back of the tent. The grass there was flattened, still warm to the touch. I crouched down and ran my hand along it. It was dry, like the lion's body had soaked up the dew before it could form. The shape of the body was clear, long, wide, and heavy. The tracks leading away were deep, clear in the powdery dirt. Big round pads.
No claw marks.
Lion. I followed the tracks a short distance into the bush, maybe 20 or 30 meters, where they veered off toward a rocky rise. I didn't go further. I didn't want to push my luck. I walked back to camp, slowly, calmly, the way you're supposed to when you've had a close call and don't want to look like prey. Back at the tent, I sat down on my camp stool and made coffee with shaking hands. I didn't really start to feel it until that point. The adrenaline had kept me steady, focused. But now that the sun was up and the lion was gone, I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. I didn't say a word out loud, didn't mutter or curse or anything. I just sat there and thought about how close I'd come, how thin that wall was, how easy it could have been for the lion to do something different, to get curious, to test me, to decide it didn't like the smell of humans so close. But it didn't. It lay there, slept, kept warm, then walked away, just like Nala, my little cat. The difference was Nala weighs about 3 kilos. That lion probably tipped the scale near 250. I broke camp that morning. I didn't need another night out there. I had enough data, and I didn't feel like tempting fate. I made notes, took photos of the tracks, then packed up slow and methodical. I didn't want to rush. You never want to seem nervous when you're out there, even if there's no one watching. On the drive back, I kept going over the moment in my mind, the way it had felt, that quiet pressure, that heat, that stillness. It wasn't a moment of violence. It wasn't an attack. It was something else, a reminder. Out there in the wild, we aren't special. We aren't dominant. We aren't anything but another warm body among many. That lion didn't see me as a threat or food or anything else, just warmth. Maybe I was the safest thing in the cold. In the end, it really was just a big cat, looking for a little comfort, a little heat on a freezing night. But even now, every time I sleep in a tent, and I still do often, I never sleep with my back against the wall. I always leave space. I never sleep too deeply. And I always remember that warm pressure and how lucky I was that it stayed soft and still and quiet. Because out there, it's not about who you are. It's about how the wild decides to treat you that night. I've always preferred the quiet of nature over the noise of cities. When I started working in wildlife conservation in southern Africa, I knew I'd be spending a lot of time outdoors, on trails, in camps, inside hideouts waiting for signs of movement. But I never thought I'd end up pressed against the body of a lion while trying not to breathe too loud. I'd done plenty of backcountry camping by then. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't new. I always followed rules. I kept my distance from wild animals, stored food properly, stayed low profile, and pitched my tent away from game trails and water sources. This time was no different. It was winter. The Lowveld gets surprisingly cold at night, especially when you're out in the open with no power, no insulation, just canvas and layers of clothing between you and the night. Days are dry, sunny, sometimes reaching the mid-20s, but by sundown it drops fast, often close to freezing by midnight. I had set up camp alone that week, tracking rhino movements for an anti-poaching study. We were trying to understand how certain solitary bulls moved through unpatrolled zones. I wasn't near a tourist lodge or a rest camp, just deep bush, a basic dome tent, a canvas chair, and a few packs of canned food.
No fences.
No people for kilometers, just raw land stretching in every direction. That evening, after a long, hot walk, I found a flat stretch between a few low shrubs that gave me a good sight line around the area. I didn't want to be near tall grass or thickets. Visibility matters. I pitched my tent with its back to a patch of short trees and made a small fire. It was legal, low risk, just big enough to boil water. I had a headlamp, a satellite phone, and a bolt-action rifle zipped in a soft case inside the tent, just for emergencies. Dinner was quick: baked beans, a chunk of maize meal, a flask of hot tea. No music, no lights, just the bush settling into its nighttime rhythm. I sat outside for a while, watching the fire die down, staring into the stars. The Southern Cross sat low in the sky. Cold air wrapped around my neck and fingers, but I held off crawling into the sleeping bag until I couldn't stand the chill anymore. When I finally zipped the tent behind me, I was exhausted. Not just from walking, but from constantly scanning tracks, kneeling to examine dung, marking GPS points, and watching for signs of predators. Even if you don't see them, they see you. It's something you learn early out here. Inside the tent, I rolled into my sleeping bag and curled on my side, back to the canvas wall. The bag was thick, rated for 0 degrees, and I wore thermals underneath. I tucked my knees up a bit, getting comfortable. The earth beneath was hard and dry, and I had a foam mat for some insulation. I remember closing my eyes and feeling my body finally relax, finally loosen after hours of tension. Sometime later, I have no clue how long, I stirred. Not because of a sound or a sudden movement, just a change in pressure. The wall of the tent behind my back was no longer just nylon and air. It had shape, it had warmth, it had weight. At first, in that fuzzy space between dreaming and waking, it felt almost nice.
Familiar.
The kind of warmth you might feel when someone sneaks into bed and presses close. Not hard, not sharp, just solid and warm. I didn't think anything of it. I was too far gone into sleep. But then my body started catching up. I realized I wasn't home. I wasn't in a house. I was in a nylon tent, in lion territory, and something massive was lying against the back of my tent. I froze. My eyes opened. I stared into the dark fabric ahead of me, trying to breathe without moving. It was a heavy heat, pressed from shoulder to knee, slow and rhythmic. Breathing, whatever it wasn't fidgeting or sniffing, it was resting. I tried to think clearly. Nothing made sense. No animals should be pressing up against a tent like this. I'd seen curious hyenas nudge at a flap. I'd had jackals pace around. But this wasn't a nudge. This was full contact. Like something decided I was a warm wall on a freezing night. My spine felt locked. The space between me and the canvas, mere centimeters, was now shared. I could feel each slow rise and fall, each breath, A thick, dense kind of heat so much broader than any human frame. If I had to guess, I'd say it had rolled its back up against mine. I wasn't pressed against ribs or shoulder blades. It was too smooth, too steady. It wasn't sniffing. It wasn't curious. It was asleep. A lion. It had to be. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just lay there, feeling my own heartbeat crash against my chest. I could feel blood pulsing in my neck, in my ears. I was afraid even my breath might shake the fabric and wake it. I remembered something someone once told me, older tracker, been around longer than I've been alive. He said when a lion is close, you don't make decisions. You just stay still. You hope it doesn't see you. You don't try to think your way out of it. You just become nothing. That's what I did. I lay there, every muscle dead still, barely breathing, listening to the world outside the tent, listening for anything. But there was no movement, no sound, just my own thoughts clawing at the inside of my head. Every second felt like a lifetime. I started counting slowly to keep from panicking. Every time I reached 50, I'd start over. That went on for hours, or at least it felt like it. At some point, the weight shifted. It didn't lurch. It didn't growl. It simply stirred. A soft stretch, like waking up from a nap. Then came the pressure of it lifting, slow and easy, like it had decided it was time to go. I heard the gentle slide of grass as its body brushed against the tent and moved away. Then the footsteps, 4, heavy, slow, pressed deep into the earth. The ground was dry, and the weight left clear, deliberate indentations. I didn't look. I didn't turn. I just stayed where I was until I couldn't hear it anymore. Eventually, dawn broke. Pale light filtered through the trees, and the chill in the air had sharpened. I didn't sleep again. I just lay there, wrapped in my bag, body sore, mind empty. When I finally got up, I moved like a ghost. Unzipped the tent carefully, stood slowly. The first thing I did was check the back of the tent. The grass was flattened in a perfect impression. Broad, heavy, pressed into the earth like someone had lain down for hours. The shape wasn't exact, but the weight was obvious. And next to it, prints. Big ones. Lion. Not a female. Not a cub. This was full-grown. Male. I followed the tracks for about 20 meters before they faded into dry dust and leaf litter. I didn't go far. I didn't want to push my luck. I just stood there for a while, staring at the ground, at the space where it had been. It had laid there all night, pressed right up against me, resting, not hunting, not curious, just sleeping. It was only then that I started to feel the full weight of it all. I crouched down, elbows on my knees, and stayed there until my hands stopped shaking. All that time, all those hours I'd spent being cautious, doing things right, picking smart campsites, it didn't matter. The wild decides. You don't get a say, you just get a chance. I packed up my gear that morning without rush. Methodical, focused. I didn't panic, but I wasn't wasting a single minute either. I marked the tracks, took photos, logged coordinates, and made a report. But more than anything, I just wanted to leave that place. Not because it had gone wrong, but because it had gone right just barely. Because I'd been a few centimeters away from something that could kill me without effort, and instead of tearing through the tent or testing me, it had just cuddled, like I was another warm rock, like I was part of the bush. Nothing to be scared of, nothing worth hurting, just something solid, still, and warm on a cold night. It humbled me more than anything else ever had out there. After I got back to the ranger station, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I showed the photos, wrote up the notes, explained the prints near camp, but I left out the part about being pressed up against its back. That was something I kept to myself. Not because I was afraid of sounding weak or stupid, but because it felt like something sacred. Not a blessing, not luck, just reality, raw and cold and bigger than me. I still camp, still work in the bush, still go out for days at a time with nothing but a pack, a tent, and a plan. But I don't sleep with my back to the tent wall anymore. I don't curl into the canvas for warmth. I leave space behind me, and I sleep a little lighter, just in case. Because I now know, without doubt, that lions don't always roar before they appear. Sometimes they don't make a sound. Sometimes they just lie down next to you and sleep. And if you're lucky, really lucky, that's all they want.